I'd just like to welcome a couple of new folks this evening. So it's great to have you with us, Andrew. And it's good to have Dorrit with us. Dorrit is a friend of Flora's, who Flora bought her cattle off. So they've been working together a bit. And it's great to have some new faces on the webinar as well this evening. So I'm going to hand over to Nikki and to Ed this evening. Thanks, Nikki.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. And yeah, really looking forward to this evening's session where we're going to be talking about grazing for soil health. It is, out of the 5 sessions, my favourite, mostly because grazing is what I love talking about and what I love kind of doing. And yeah, I really hope that we'll be able to have some good discussion. Normally, I'm sorry, I'm getting really distracted by how sunny and lovely it is wherever Oliver is. That looks absolutely delightful, and I think we should all just stop and admire the sunshine. I'm significantly lacking in vitamin D at the moment, so I'm like obsessing over anywhere that's warm and sunny. But yeah, sorry, I got totally distracted then. But yeah, looking forward to chatting about grazing. Mostly because I've been out in the rain, in the wind and some of the rain and snow, dealing with water that wouldn't work today. But anyway, there we go. So in this session, normally when I deliver, I normally deliver like a day's workshop on regenerative grazing, and I'm going to fit a day's workshop into 20 minutes. So we're going to be very fast, we're going to be very focused. And there'll be lots and lots of things that we don't talk about that we should talk about, but we're just going to crack on anyway because of time limitations. And then, as usual, we will have the opportunity between Ed and myself to chat about what do these things look like in, particularly for Ed and his experience, and what do these things look like on farm. And yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for those of you that sent photos in. It was great to see them. I've had some forwarded to me on WhatsApp, which I didn't quite have the opportunity to put on my presentation, but I do. Oh, can I be allowed to share my screen, please? But I did manage to get a few on there. So we've had some from Ed, and I think I've got some from Lucy as well. So thanks to everyone who did share those. There we go. I can now share my screen. Okay, so we will very quickly just have a look at these photos. Can you see that okay? Is that in presentation mode? There we go. That should be now. Oh, cool.
You can see it, but it's not. It is now.
It is cool. Amazing. Thank you. So some photos that were sent over, and this was thinking from last week's homework. We're thinking about what does the ground look like? What does the sward look like when we stand above it and we look directly down? And we're thinking about that basal ground cover. So what bare earth can we see? And I think, Ed, this was from your farm. Do you want to just talk us through, maybe explain the photos to us, if you don't mind?
Yeah, so the one on the left is in the middle of the field. Basically, it was an ex-arable field, and it's been out of arable for about 4 or 5 years now. The two first and second photos are from the middle of the field, and the one on the right is the arable margin. And basically, you can see the health of the arable margin is doing considerably much better than the middle of the field. It's been grazed by horses at the moment, which doesn't really help, but yeah, I've stitched in a legume mix into some ryegrass, and this is the aftermath. And then yeah, the arable margin is sort of 10 or 15 years of natural regen, really.
Nice, thanks, Ed, for explaining that. And I think it's really interesting being able to see the difference between long established grassland on the right hand side from that margin, and then grassland that is much more recently gone in. And yeah, what I will say about horses, so I manage some horses in a mob grazing system. They're so different to managing like cattle or sheep in one of these sorts of systems. And I don't know if these were just kind of let loose wherever they want to go, but I've been finding it increasingly challenging to get that grazing impact right with horses. They don't graze or move like cows do, for example, so it's a very different level of impact, and you tend to get a lot more bare earth from horse presence than you would with cattle. Though that being said, in a newer temporary grassland, you're probably going to get more gaps than you would in something much older, but it is really interesting to see. And just thinking about you know, that thing of, if we look down and we worked out how much of that soil is actually, how much of that ground is actually soil and bare earth as opposed to growing plants, we can start thinking about the impact that heavy rainfall might have on that ground. Or we might want to think about how actually productive is it, how many square meters are actually growing grass, how many acres are actually growing grass, and how many of them are currently at risk of capping, for example. So we are being a bit mean picking on some ex-arable fields here, because they are the ones that are kind of more battered and bruised when they then go into a temporary grassland. But I just think it's really interesting when we stop and take a moment to have a look. And luckily Lucy has done the same, and I think I put these the wrong way around, Lucy, but this is the same fields that you shared from last week, is that right?
Yes, so the one on the left is a grass, kind of our parkland, that gets a lot of rest, and not that patch, but some has had bale grazing on. One on the, basically the same as we talked about last week. Then the one on the right is one of our lay-by fields, which gets overgrazed and gets quite a bit of abuse, to be honest.
There's a lot of plantain in there, and lots of what looks like probably buttercup, and also maybe some oxeye daisy. There's quite diverse species, right? So there's a lot of flowering plants in there.
Yeah, Ed will be able to tell you exactly what's in there. I don't know.
But yeah, it's interesting again, that thing of actually we've got plants that we've got a lot of broadleaf plants that actually luckily take up, was quite a bit, maybe dandelion as well in there, that take up quite a lot of space with their leaves. If we kind of move those leaves out the way, there again would be quite a lot of bare soil. I mean, we can see there's a fair bit of bare soil, but actually in terms of how much of that is actually growing grass, then yeah, probably, or growing edible plants, shall we say, definitely less than on the left hand side. But then we do also have challenges with these kind of taller swards, where we might get things like couch grass, which is creeping, or a creeping bent, for example, which then, you know, it grows from one point and then creeps across the surface. And actually, if it's not kind of grazed out every few years quite hard, what you end up having is one plant that ends up just taking up quite a lot of surface area, and that doesn't necessarily reflect then lots of root activity driving that soil ecosystem health. So sometimes it can look like you've got quite a lot of good cover, which may well be good for soil protection, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all of that is functioning roots that are in the ground, depending on your grass species, which is why it's important to be able to start kind of identifying some of these grasses. And even if you don't really know what they are, if you pull some of it up and it comes up in a sort of mat like that, then those are your creeping grasses that potentially can actually be not that helpful in terms of in terms of generating soil health, because you've only got, for each one of those big plants, one set of roots, whereas if we had multiple plants that was covering the same area, we'd have a lot more root activity going on. Though creeping grasses do definitely have a place. Excellent. Thank you so much for sending those, and thanks to others who sent them in. But as I said, they went to my WhatsApp and it was difficult to get them on onto the PowerPoint with the limited time I had. Oh, and these were just photos that I think I shared when I delivered this back in October. So this is some of our autumn grazing. And so, yeah, I think at that point it was just to sort of see what covers we would be going into, what the grazing is looking like at that particular point of the year for us. And I don't really like going into anything in that wet time of year in the back end, anything less than the left hand side. That's kind of what I like to take cattle into. I worry about too much soil damage if it's anything less than that. Doesn't mean that's the same for everybody, but that's my preference. But anyway, we're going to crack on. So grazing practices to improve soil health. So we're going to be thinking about how our grazing management actually influences soil health. There are multiple other factors that we will touch on this evening, but remembering that our primary focus is on healthy soils. Healthy soils, that means healthy plants, healthy animals, but remembering it's part of an ecosystem. So if we want healthy soils, we have to have plants doing their job. And if we want plants to do their job, we need to give them the rest and the time to recover in order to do that. And so we're going to talk about some key terms when we're thinking about grazing management. And the majority of the session, we're going to be thinking very much about kind of graze and rest systems. So adaptive multi-paddock grazing, mob grazing. For some of you using holistic management, you might be thinking about holistic planned grazing. So there's that kind of graze and rest, those pulses of grazing with rest periods after them is the focus really. However, that doesn't mean that conservation grazing doesn't have a place. It absolutely does. And that kind of low number of animals in a very extensive system where they are being deployed to fulfill a particular job absolutely for some of the habitats, particularly where you are in the southeast of England, is going to be really, really important. However, as per a conversation I had with a colleague from Plant Life this week, you know, he said there's conservation grazing and then there's conservation grazing. There's the conservation grazing where people just stick like 10 cows in a nature reserve and kind of come back 6 months later, and regardless of what's happened, they just kind of go, oh well, there we go, that happened, and off they go again. And they just do that year after year, and that's just, you know, they're aligned with the prescription that's been set out by Natural England, and they're doing the job as far as they're concerned. And then there's conservation grazing that's more intentional, it's more considered, it's more thoughtful, and it actually requires ongoing monitoring. The same level, I think, of monitoring and observation that we would be expecting from these kind of systems where we're moving animals frequently. And then we also have that lovely crossover space where, you know, people are using things like no fence collars to try and create some of the benefits from those graze and rest systems, but are deploying those into more of a conservation grazing setting. So there's a spectrum. And I guess the key thing for me is that the grazing that we're talking about for soil health is intentional, we're considered, we're engaging our brains a little bit. We're not just kind of chucking animals in a field and hoping for the best. And the reason that we, as a kind of sector, had got to a point where we were chucking animals and hoping for the best was because whatever problems that arose from that, we could fix them with chemicals, right? So if we had animals, you know, historically animals would have been moved frequently, which would have prevented them from having to cope with parasite burden. Well, if we mechanize everything and we take people off the land and we don't have people to move animals around, we end up with having greater parasite burden issues, but we can resolve that just by worming. So the mechanization of agriculture, the industrialization of agriculture led us to a point where we had fewer people who weren't then able to move animals, and we were then able to fix sticking plasters over the problems by, again, applying those kind of chemical industrialized solutions. And so this whole kind of way of grazing for soil health takes us back to a point where people were more on the land and engaged, and we were thinking more about natural processes and how they can actually help us to produce pasture and soils that were healthy, that could produce animals that were healthy. And I'm not putting any blame on anybody, it's just sort of setting out the reason why we're in the situation that we're in. And you know, the majority of that was driven by policy, not by farmers. Anyway, getting off my tangent, well, let's look at key terms. So these are sort of some of the words that you might come across in the session this evening. And for some of them, you'll know these inside out and back to front. And for others, you'll think, what on earth is she on about? So I thought I'll just go through them quickly. So the grazing platform, this is the fields on the farm that are going to get grazed each year. Now, sometimes if you have a 100-acre farm and 10 acres of it is an arable field and 5 acres is woodland and the rest of it is pasture that you know you're going to graze, that means your grazing platform would be 85 acres. So your grazing platform and your farm size don't always add up to the same. They might do, they might not. And actually your farm might be 100 acres, but your grazing platform might be 120 because you take on some seasonal grazing for somebody at some point in the year. So the grazing platform isn't just the size of the farm, it's the place, the amount of land that you're going to graze in a season or in a grazing year. Then we talk quite often about covers, and I think I've already mentioned that I want to go into particular length of covers. So the covers is the grass in the field. There's lots of ways to measure that. You can use a plate meter, you can use a sward stick, you can use your welly, you can use the front of your truck, depending on what it is that you're measuring and how tall it is. We're not going to go into measuring this evening, we just don't have time, but covers is the grass that you're going into, and the residual is the grass that you're leaving behind. So we want decent residuals if we want to create healthy soils. There are times though we might want to take those residuals right down, but that again is part of that being engaged, thinking about our grazing and planning it. If we're talking about a rotation length, so you might hear, I don't know, a dairy farmer on a 21-day rotation, or you might hear somebody like me on a 130-day rotation. That means it's the number of days rest a field gets before it gets regrazed. So you might identify, right, this is my grazing platform, and I'm going to start the year on a 50-day rotation, just as the grass starts growing. I don't want to go too quickly because it's still cold and we might have a cold snap. So I'm going to go in on a 45, 50-day rotation. So it's going to take me 45 to 50 days to get around my grass. As I'm going, I might think, oh, grass is really growing. It's getting warmer. I'm going to speed this up. So the number of days rotation that you have in your system is flexible. It can change at any time in the year. But if you're hearing people say things like, oh, on a 30-day rotation or 21-day rotation, that's basically what that means. And this is a personal bugbear, the difference between stocking rate and stocking density. So stocking rate relates to the amount of land allotted to each animal or livestock unit for the entire grazable portion of the year, versus, and that could be the full year, versus the number of acres or hectares allotted to each animal or livestock unit at a specific point in time. So on the land that we graze, we run understocked because of the way that we access land. It reduces the risk for us if we understock. So we have quite a low stocking rate. However, our daily stocking density is actually quite high because we're putting animals into smaller paddocks. So stocking density could be your daily or your 2-day or your 3-day period that you're putting animals in a paddock if you're moving them frequently. Your stocking rate is it's about across the whole year. So the two things are slightly different. What we find often is that particularly people like Natural England tend to confuse them, but they are slightly different. And then the most important piece of equipment in the growing season, other than your water system, is your back fence. So a back fence is the thing that is going to prevent animals from returning to areas they have already grazed. And that is the way that we're going to prevent overgrazing. So if an animal comes in, and I've got some images to show you later on, if an animal comes in and grazes a plant right down in one bite, that isn't overgrazing. Overgrazing is when the plant gets regrazed before it's ready to be regrazed and before it's fully recovered. And if you want a very quick, kind of slightly wonky, not always accurate indicator, if you go into a field and the grass has got pointy tips, it means it's recovered. If you go into a field and you can still see a blunt edge where it's been eaten by a cow or a sheep, it isn't ready to be grazed. So it's a quick kind of indicator. Oh, could I bring my animals back on here? It looks quite long, but actually if it's got a pointy tip, it is ready. If it's got blunt tips, if you can see lots of blunt tips, then it probably isn't ready to be regrazed. So we don't want to be grazing plants that are in recovery mode. A little bit like if you're absolutely knackered and you've had a really hard day's work, and you're in recovery mode, you're trying to kind of get back, or if you've not been well and you're kind of getting back into, you're resting, recovering, getting ready for the next challenge ahead of you, and someone comes and kicks you in the kneecaps, you're not going to do very well. So what we want to do is make sure that we're not setting grass back, because if we set grass back at that point, the risk is that we're going to reduce the root length, and that means that our soil health is going to suffer as a result. Okay. Also to say that animal impact is way more than just grazing. So grazing is one part of it, but we also have the presence of saliva and the various microbial reactions that happen as a result of that. We've got the presence of dung and urine. We've got microbes being moved about by the animals themselves. We've got seed potentially being transported. We've got trampling, which is a massive impact that we often don't think about. And then obviously if we've got kind of scrub or wooded areas, we're going to have branches being broken and we're going to have animals rubbing up against them and maybe smashing up dead wood. So when we think about animal impact, we're not just thinking about grazing. And, we've talked before about wet weather. It might not be the grazing that's having the challenge. It's the presence of hooves that's actually the bit that's causing us to think, oh God, I probably need to move these animals on more quickly. So although we're going to be generally using grazing as a catch-all term this evening, we need to remember that the impact that animals have is way more than just them removing biomass through the action of grazing. And so just an overview of different grazing management approaches, and I can take no credit for these excellent graphics. They were developed by Sarah Morgan, who was at Rothamsted. She's now at Harper Adams. She's a researcher that has been comparing set stock to cell graze systems for the last few years. She's just about to publish the first paper on that. And she did this really useful graphic that just basically sort of sets out the different types of grazing management. Now, you'll notice in all of these pictures there's the same number of animals, so it's helpful to understand that with the same number of animals we can move them around in different ways and actually have different outcomes. So on the left hand side we have set stocking and we have continuous variable, where you maybe shut off some parts of the field but generally everything's pretty much grazed all of the time. And this means that we need minimal infrastructure, we don't really need many people, we can have fixed watering points, and there's low labour input. And actually, I would always argue the low labour input, because if you don't ever move animals and you're not checking them, they can be an absolute nightmare when you do need to get near them. And if you're set stocking, you're probably going to have to treat animals various times throughout the year and dose them with various wormers. So the amount of labour and time and effort it takes and stress to do all of that I think, offsets the kind of more frequent labour of maybe moving electric fences or checking animals more frequently. But yeah, I would love to do a kind of a study on that at some point and actually kind of take note of all of that. But set stocking generally, you know, it's animals everywhere, and there is no rest in that system. So those fields have animals in them from when the growing season starts to when the growing season ends, and those plants are continuously at risk of being overgrazed, because every time the plant tries to regrow, a mouth comes along and chomps it off. So the challenge there is that we're going to have short plants, short roots, and we're going to have greater areas of compaction and issues around where animals have loafed as well, which we'll come on to, and similar for continuous. And then we start kind of moving along this spectrum of kind of moving towards more kind of planned grazing and thinking about resting and grazing. And so there's a relaxed rotational where maybe we've got animals in 2 fields, and then we swap them and put them in 2 different fields, and then we swap them back and put them into 2 other fields. Again, you kind of don't really get any control over the grazing pressure. There's very little kind of rest periods, and it definitely allows for selective grazing, which might be fine at some times of the year, which we can come to later. And then we also have strip grazing, now often used in the dairy industry and also quite prevalent, obviously, on forage crops, things like that, where you're just moving the front fence. If this is in the middle of summer, well, in the middle of the growing season, and you are on pasture, then you're definitely going to get higher risk of overgrazing. Though what I would say is that every time you give animals a new allocation, they do tend to follow the new grass. So they might go back a little bit and loaf, they might hang out a little bit on the grass that they've already been on, but generally, that as long as they get into that habit of moving, it's not quite as bad as sort of just leaving them there and letting them eat whatever they want. But you do have that risk of them going back. But it's a nice way to start if you can't move your water. If you've got fixed water and the only way that you can kind of control grazing is moving the front fence only, then try that. I would probably prefer going down a route of where I did more of a relaxed rotational in this setting and just put all of them in 1 field and then move them into another field and basically work around 4 fields rather than kind of this approach where you're just moving the front fence. But again, it can be context dependent. And then we get to this kind of adaptive grazing management. So this is our graze and rest. And all of these may be present in any system at any time. For example, we've got areas where there are fixed water troughs, so we will hub and spoke around the water trough in some places. We've got other places where we might take more of a paddock grazing approach where we fix water and then work around it, but I'd say that that's happening less and less. That's not really an approach for us, but you tend to find that in kind of I would say kind of probably more conventional, that are moving towards systems where they're really trying to push growth and push production. Paddock grazing works really well in like ryegrass, maybe ryegrass, clover, grasslands that's getting reseeded quite frequently. It tends to respond quite well, but there are significant costs associated with that, such as fertilizer, reseeds, etc. So paddock grazing definitely has a place, and there are people who are making it work really, really well. There are benefits for the soil health because there is rest in that system, but it's a sort of system that's kind of still being held up to some extent by inputs. But it's a really nice kind of halfway house for a lot of people in terms of their grazing management. And then we move on to mob grazing, where we've got much smaller cells, we're moving more frequently, we need to think more about our water infrastructure. And then in cell grazing, we've kind of taken that and amped it right up again, where we've got an even higher density. These approaches really do require that additional infrastructure, such as water that can work anywhere in the field, where you've either got multiple or movable troughs. There is a higher labour input potentially on a daily basis, but as I said, moving animals every single day, from my experience, means I get to see animals every single day. I can make judgments on their mobility, I can do dung scoring, I can look at rumen fill, I can assess for body condition. There's lots of things that you can get on a daily basis from moving animals that you're not necessarily going to get if they're kind of just in a field. And my experience, you know, not having had to use any wormers at all, any sort of pour-ons in the last 5 years, I think, and we're FEC testing, so fecal egg count testing frequently every month, because we're in a study, we're not finding any results. We're not finding any eggs ever. And I think that moving animals frequently is the thing that's really making the difference. And the other thing about this, thinking back to last week's session when we talked about nutrient cycling, is that the manure distribution really varies depending on your grazing management. Now, cattle and sheep are prey animals, And if any of you are interested in the work of Alan Savory, you'll know that one of his key insights is the impact of predators. So if you start introducing a predator to prey animals, their behavior changes. It's not just about them being kind of killed or culled. Actually, the way that they behave, the way that they move, they herd up, they're not kind of hanging out on their own. Their behavior really changes. And so in the absence of wolves in the UK, one way that we can become a predator is by using electric fence. We can use the electric fence as a predator to move animals around in a slightly different way. And that can help us to change the manure distribution. So on that left-hand side, because cows and sheep are pretty lazy, they'll hang out by the water, and then they might mosey about a little bit, and they might go and find somewhere to have a bit of a scratch, or they might go somewhere for a bit of shade or shelter, but generally they'll hang out closer to the water, they'll loaf there, they'll stand there. Dung deposition and urine is quite high. And then that means that we're going to have a manure that is concentrated in that corner of the field and much less everywhere else. So if you're an organic farmer or you're a farmer that's trying to reduce significantly your inputs, you want to make sure that your manure, that nutrient, that valuable nutrient, is distributed as evenly as it possibly can be across your grazing platform. So in the middle, in our typical rotational grazing, again, where you're just maybe for once a week, they're moving around, we've got a week in each paddock, we're going to see the manure distribution again. It's going to be concentrated around the water, but it's definitely better distributed than in a continuous grazing set stock system. And then again, if we move to a more adaptive grazing where we're moving once or twice a day, we're moving according to observations, we might be varying the paddock size, we've got a lot more control over what's going on. With longer rest period between returning to those paddocks, we have a much more even manure distribution. And we also see the manure breaking down quite quickly as well if we're able to manage animals in this way and we're not using unfiltered ticks, etc. So there's definitely an implication for our grazing management on our nutrient deposition and nutrient management, and also then the soil health, because the microbes in the soil will respond to that in different ways. And so we're going to have a more even cover across the field if we're able to manage that grazing a little bit more in a planned way. And just to kind of build on that, this idea that if we have that continuous grazing, we're going to have no rest, which means that we're going to have not many animals. Our stocking density is going to remain quite low, and our stocking rate then is going to be reflected potentially by that. We're going to have groundwater puddling on the surface because we don't have that root action that's going to be able to help draw that water down. We're not going to have that many worms, and we're going to have potentially quite a lot of compaction near the top. And if we start building in a bit of rest, what we tend to see, let's say it's resting 75% of the time, grazing 25%, we're definitely creating enough time and space for those roots to really get down into the soil profile. And we're going to have roots operating at a lower level and higher up as well. So we've got not just deeper roots, but those roots have branches that mean that they're operating at multiple levels in the soil profile, which then is associated by increased microbial and mycorrhizal activity. And then if we move into this kind of much more adaptive grazing, where we're grazing maybe 5% of the time, and the majority of the time that ground is getting rested, then what we're able to see is those really, really deep tap roots from my favorite plants like docks, but others as well, things like chicory. And we're going to see a lot more kind of cover above ground, so greater biomass, greater structure. So plant structure as well as diversity is really important. So not just the species diversity, but the structural diversity to create habitat for different and different niches for different insect populations or small mammals. All of that is going to drive even more life. So rest really is the thing that's going to help us to get to that point without mechanical intervention, without having to spend a huge amount of money, and to enable that system to start working on its own and be self-sufficient. Some of you may have heard of the work of Jim Elizondo, and there's a lot of things that I don't agree with Jim, and we've had various debacles at various events that we've both been speaking at in the last year. But one thing he says that I really agree with is that nature is always, always, always aiming for like maximum abundance. Like if we get out the way, nature just creates life, right? And so the more rest that we can give, the more life we're going to get. It might not, there's a caveat. We might not get the life that we want. We might not see the plants that we'd expect to see or that we particularly prefer if we have favorite plants, but nature will always push for abundance and optimal productivity if we get out the way and allow her to do so. Okay, I'm just going to talk very quickly how we're doing for time. I really need to be quiet because we're at past already. But if we have our short grazing periods and our long rest and recovery, I just want to give you that example, as I mentioned earlier, about overgrazing really does have implications for the plant, for the soil, and for rainfall resilience. If we go in and we've got that lovely tall plant on the left-hand side and an animal has come in and given it a good munch, and they might munch it again, take it down another bite, but we're then going to get the animals off and we're going to let it rest. And now if we let it rest at that point, we've still got all that lovely root mass doing its thing. So the plant, it goes into recovery from the base of the plant upwards, and the roots are able to still work and connect with all of the other microbial life and microorganisms in the soil, driving that soil function, enabling that soil health. If, however, we go onto the right-hand side of that picture and we've let that cow stay in that field way too long, and every time the plant gets munched and it starts to regrow, she comes back and has another munch, and she comes back and has another munch. Because remember, these plants are going to be pumping a load of sugars to try and get that energy from the base of the plant into the rest of the plant to get it to grow. So it's going to be this massive kind of like energy output. And the cow comes along or the sheep comes along and thinks, that's tasty, and has another bite. If we continue to allow those animals to bite the plant off, what we will get is the plant needing to rely on the roots to give its energy. And when the roots have to start providing the energy, they die off. And so that's when we get shortened roots, we get less root activity, we get less activity in the rhizosphere. Remember, that magical place where all the good stuff happens. So we start compromising the health of that plant. And the minute we start compromising the health of the plant, we compromise the health of the soil, because all of these things are connected. What we do know is that trampling whilst grazing can help feed the soil and can increase organic matter. That's something that Jim Elizondo doesn't agree with. He says that trampling is not what does that. He doesn't agree with trampling in the plant matter. He very much is of the opinion that it's deep roots that are able to drive that soil function, and that's what's going to be increasing the humus content of soil. I agree with him and also with Greg Judy, who kind of is the trampling guy. So you've got these two guys who are kind of promoting different methods of grazing. Greg Judy on one side of the spectrum, who's kind of going across and skim grazing and doesn't ever really graze anything right down. And then you've got the likes of Jim Elizondo on the other side, who quite often would promote a total graze, where animals are eating it right down to the boards, if you like, but doing that in an ultra high density way. So it's within 1 or 2 bites, and they're moving on, and they're moving maybe 8 times a day. And my kind of thinking on this, and all the reading I've been doing and my own observations, is that we're somewhere in the middle, that actually we do need long roots, and there are times when we need to skim graze, and there are times when we need to take things right down. And actually, if we become too wedded to one approach, that's when we're going to come unstuck, because actually we need to be really adaptive and respond to what's in front of us. I'm going to skip over that because of time, and also just to very quickly say that things change as we go through the year. You will want to get going quicker when the grass is growing. So for example, my approach would be, as that new spring growth really starts coming, I'm going to skim across the fields. I'm going to move quite quickly. I don't want to hit that grass too hard. And I might then want to think about, if I'm moving them quite quickly and they're getting quite a lot of green, buffer that with a bit of hay, for example, just to try and kind of manage their intake. When we get into late spring and the grass is really pumping, we're going to be moving really, really quickly across the platform. And that might be that we're moving more frequently, or it might be that our paddocks are bigger. However, you then run the risk of then allowing for much too selective grazing if our paddocks are bigger. And this is something we can go through in the Q&A in a minute if we need to, if you need a bit of help clarifying that, because sometimes it takes a while to kind of get that into your head. It took me a while for sure. I've always definitely wanted to leave them on too long, much longer than is good for the soil. That's a real learning curve I've had to go through over the last few years. And then we get this kind of summer slump where the grass growth really slows down and the seed heads are present, or we're getting flowering plants coming through. So we're going to leave longer residuals. We might think about taking a hay cut, deferring for hay, or for standing hay, and coming back to where we first grazed. So that summer slump is a point at which we can kind of make some decisions about planning then ahead. How are we going to use this grass as we go on through the summer, also taking into account potential drought conditions, which for you guys is becoming more frequent. And then in the autumn, we get hopefully an autumn flush when it rains. We had loads of that this last autumn, and the autumn before we didn't really have much at all. So, you know, it is changing every year. And so what we need to do is be as adaptive as we possibly can be and create systems that are resilient to that change. And then in the winter dormant season, we're going to slow everything down, and we're going to go really, really slow and steady across the grazing platform. And there might be areas that we sacrifice, that we kind of keep animals on for longer. We can make our paddocks smaller. We can really hold animals back so that when we do get to the spring, we've got the ability for plants to start growing much more quickly. I know our focus here really is on soil health, but I can't talk about grazing management without talking about animal health and welfare. The taller swards really do encourage animals to graze above the parasite zone. So the parasite zone is up to 15 centimetres. So if your grass is shorter than 15 centimetres, your animals will always be in the parasite zone. If we have a taller sward, then that really supports those animals to come out of that danger zone, out of that high risk zone, and it can reduce the risk of parasite burden. A mixed bite, so plenty of green and brown, as shown in that image, is going to really help regulate rumen function. So green grass is high in protein, brown grass is high in fibre. We don't want too much of either. So we want to have a nice mix so that we're getting a nice slow clap cow pat, for example, which ends up in a nice round kind of circle with what I call a dip and a slick in the middle. I'm not quite sure what the sheep equivalent is, but it's not too squishy and it's not too hard. So that's kind of what we're looking for. And that can really indicate to us that we've got our grazing management right. Remember, livestock co-evolved with grasslands, you know, our ruminants co-evolved with grasslands. And so looking at our animal health can really tell us a lot about our plant health and our soil health. But I would say that animal health and welfare should always take priority. So things like shade, shelter, grass availability. Sometimes, you know, you might think when we're mob grazing and we're out in the middle of a field and there's no shade or shelter and the weather turns, you know, we really need to think about, well, can I let them back to a hedge? Can I actually just change my grazing plan? I don't have to graze this now. I could move them somewhere else. For example, 2 days ago, I could not get water at all to where one of my groups of cattle's grazing. Just was having an absolute nightmare with an unexpected very cold temperatures overnight and an airlock somewhere along the pipe. So I just had to move them, and I just had to take them out of the field. You know, they were halfway around a field. I just had to take them out of there, and I'll just come back to it. So you need to be flexible with your plan. So the plan itself isn't what's key, it's the planning process that's more important. And the other thing is the kind of taller swards creating a cooler environment, which is beneficial in hot weather, which we will talk about in the final session where we look at managing in extremes. So key concepts: rest is the most powerful tool in our toolbox, I would say, but yeah, it's definitely a powerful tool. Trampled leaf matter feeds the soil, and it also creates an armor, protects the soil, particularly when we're going to have increased heavy rainfall. We need to think about matching the speed across our grazing platform to the speed of the grass growth, so faster when it's growing and slow down when it's dormant. The more paddocks we can create, the more subdivisions, the more rest. We've got a 10-acre field and we don't subdivide it, we don't get any rest, they're just continuously grazing. If I split it in half, then I get kind of double the rest than if I would just, you know, the whole time they're in there. But if I can get 30 paddocks and I move them every day, that means that I can potentially come back to the first paddock after my 30 days is up, if I'm at the right time of year, which, you know, means that suddenly I've got a lot more grass that I can play with. It means that I'm maybe not having to take on additional land. I'm able to grow grass much more efficiently and actually maximize the land that I've got and increase that carrying capacity potentially. And that rest really can extend the grazing season. So I can either increase the number of animals that I have, or I can graze for longer. And as I've already said, taller covers do create that greater diversity, both of species and structure. And then just to finish on some photographs, we graze all through the summer, even in the areas that are more species rich. On the right-hand side, you can see a northern marsh orchid. It's been grazed around. And we're just tweaking the paddock size so that we're not, it's really important for me that my cattle get to graze really diverse plants and flowers, but it's also really important to me that some are left behind for pollinators, and because they just have such an important role in our biodiversity crisis that we're in. So it's really, really key that we try and manage our grazing to make sure that we can have the best of both worlds. So sometimes people might suggest that actually you just move animals, you keep them off your more species rich areas, but actually what I think can happen, and people like Rob Havard have demonstrated this, if you're kind of sensible and intentional with your grazing when flowering plants are out, you actually manage to extend the flowering season, because you might graze out or trample some plants that were flowering. And then actually, because we're getting warmer temperatures longer into the year, there's an opportunity for a second flush almost of those flowering plants. And last year, was it the year before? I think it was the year before, was the first time I've ever seen, no, it was last year, 2023, because it was wet as well and quite warm, was the first time I've seen tufted vetch coming back for a second flowering. I've not seen that before. So yeah, definitely kind of seeing plant behaviors or responses to the climate changing. Right, I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to stop talking because my goodness, I've gone on way too long. And I'm going to hand over to Ed. And Ed, I'd be really interested if you could give us a quick overview of what's going on under your management. And if you can just maybe share some reflections, if you think anything that I've said is absolute nonsense, if there's things that you agree with, and yeah, and just kind of your thoughts on your grazing management for soil health.
So we're quite in the infancy of a change of management really on the farm at home. It's always been sort of traditionally set stocked, but I've been introducing some paddock grazing onto the farm and demonstrating to my dad basically that it can be done. And with that, we've seen sort of soil organic matter increase from on these ex-arable fields from sort of 3% to 7% in 3 or 4 years. So I've done some baseline studies and things like that. But no, you're not talking utter nonsense at all. It's some of it is you've got to sort of use your situation to favour your management as well. So you know, like multi-day moves might not suit some people's situation. So yeah, the more relaxed paddock grazing might suit some people's styles. But yeah, so we're at home. We've got we're a 230 hectare farm, 77 hectares of permanent pasture, 130 of arable, and about 20 hectares of woodland. But we've gone down the line of paddock grazing, realizing that resting arable fields is actually really beneficial for our soil health. So we've entered into a huge countryside stewardship and the SFI to revert all our arable into grassland lays. So our key target is to improve soil health going forward, and this is going to be using our livestock on the farm. So upping our cattle numbers. Questionable about what we're going to do with the sheep, because that's a little bit more of a different management tool, and I think the cattle favour the grazing management I want to sort of achieve. Sheep are a little bit more bit more tricky, I suppose, to manage with taller swards and things like that, and diversity in the swards. I think they selectively eat more wildflowers and things like that. So I've got to make a decision about how many sheep we're going to run. But yeah, we've deferred grazing over the winter. So we got chalk grassland downland where we outwinter. Everything's set stocked at the moment, but I'm looking to introduce some bale grazing in the next winter. So that's another change. So like I say, we're in the infancy of our change in management. Everything's deferred over the summer. So the cattle come down off the downs into the valley where it's more heavier clays and onto the ex-arable ground, and they're rotationally grazing around that. And then they go back onto the chalk grass and in the winter. So that is one thing I want to change, is the set stocking over winter.
Thanks, Ed.
Yeah.
That's really interesting, and maybe we'll open up for questions if there are any. I just want to make a comment, and I'm very conscious that I'm heavily biased towards cattle, and all my photos are cattle, just because that's the animals I spend most of my time with. I would say that there are some folk doing really, really interesting and cool things with sheep, and I'm not ever wanting people to think that sheep can't fit into these systems. They absolutely can. We've got some massive pasture for life sheep flocks that have, you know, really kind of, I'm thinking of like Balcaskey Estate up here in Scotland in Fife, you know, thousands of sheep that well, actually they are our biggest certified sheep flock, I think 3,000 ewes. And what they have found is that they just can't have the more frequent moves. So they just kind of, as you said, Ed, started to think a bit more about, right, if I'm employing these 3 lads to move these sheep, and every single, you know, they're moving every 2 days and they're always killing each other because they're so angry about the electric fence not doing what they want it to, and it getting tangled up and it being a nightmare, that's not good for anybody. And so actually thinking about what's the optimal, we're optimal for soil health. So we want some rest, and we want pulses of grazing and we want livestock presence, but actually we don't want our staff trying to kill each other. So the thing that they then decided was, right, we'll just do weekly moves. They can just move once a week, and we'll just increase the rest period as much as we can by bringing into play more of the arable land, you know, putting that into temporary grassland, and just tweaking the system so that they could work with the sheep rather than it being like, oh, the sheep don't fit the system that we've decided we have to have. So there has to be flexibility. That being said, there's some other people that are grazing sheep on really tall swards and not having any feet problems and not having any issues at all. But it might just be about the culling decisions they've been making and the selection that they've been following. So there's lots of people trying it all in different ways. And the most important thing is that you just try and visit other people doing it, that you see what's happening on other farms. I would really, really recommend, I don't know if any of you have come across Billy Lewis. He's over in Herefordshire, so a bit of a trek for you guys. Less of a trek for you than it is for me. And he runs Boycefield Farm. So they're pedigree Hereford cattle breeders. It's an incredible mixed farm, and they also manage their sheep absolutely brilliantly. And I went to see Billy and his mum Lucinda. His mum actually is an ecologist and has been working closely with farmers, very much focusing on kind of grassland and meadow restoration. And yeah, they're doing incredible things. So if you're a mixed farmer and you're wanting some inspiration, or you are thinking about how can I get sheep to fit in that system, I'd really recommend going and visiting. I don't know, maybe if you guys could organize a study tour or something, and you could go and see a few different farms who are doing things in an interesting way. I know the North group have managed to do that, and they came up to Scotland to see some farmers doing different things. So yeah, sheep definitely can fit the system. They're just not represented in my photos, and I'm sorry for that. Are there any questions?
I'll contact Nikki outside of the meeting for a couple of contacts for sheep people. So I will follow that one up.
Ali, I saw that you asked a question about, do you think that low FECs are entirely due to grazing strategy? Yeah, I do. Interestingly, so we send off dung every single month, although I missed January because it was just too cold and it was a very stressful time, to the Morden Institute, who are the kind of key research institute into parasitology in the UK. And they wanted to run the screening on our dung for fluke, because they thought that the access to trees was the thing that was making a big difference. So we have a very silver pastoral, I guess, approach to our land management. There's a lot of trees about, and we get the cattle in the trees as much as possible. I don't think I'm not sure. I think, yeah, the trees play a role for sure as the diverse sward, but I do think it's the daily moves that makes such a difference, and the long rest periods. Because I get very used to cattle not being anywhere near their dung. Like, you know, they're on fresh grass every day, and I just think it makes such a massive difference. So yeah, I do think it's the frequent moves. Interestingly, the research behind that is limited, and it finds, like, whenever research is done, it generally finds like a mix. Sometimes it makes it worse, sometimes it makes it better. But what I would say is that I don't think any research has been done on farms where it's a daily move. I think generally it's like 3-day moves, like every 3 days they're being moved on. So yeah. Anyway, I'll shut up now. Any other questions?
In the winter, can you, I mean, if you want to have the cattle out, is it better to have them on a really extensive space, or is it better to have them, I mean, should you be moving them at all, or?
Yeah, and Flora, I meant to say thank you for sending the email with all the photos. That was really helpful, and it was really nice to be able to put some context to the things that you've been describing. I'm sorry they didn't make my presentation at the start with the other pictures, but thank you so much for sharing them.
I was a webinar behind on
Don't worry. It's a really great contribution. I mean, I'm moving animals every day in the winter. I think it's as important, particularly because of the risk of poaching. I want to get animals moved on as much as possible. I also want them to have a nice fresh bite. I don't want them hanging around in their own dung. It's pretty grim for them. I wouldn't want to be standing around in muck and filth. So generally what we say is that, you know, you want to slow down the movement across the grazing platform when the grass isn't growing. So when the grass is dormant. So if you created a stockpile of grass and you're then going to move animals onto that on a daily basis, what you can do, or on a, you know, more frequent basis or less frequently, you're kind of moving them. It does just give you a bit of control around their intake. So you can actually think about, are they eating it all? Are they not really eating it? What's going on here? It allows you as well to assess the dung scores. If animals are in a place for quite a long time, you can't always tell whether it's a fresh pat or not, particularly if the weather does, you know, if they're not drying out. So I like moving animals frequently because it means I can do that dung scoring on a daily basis. And particularly when, like at the moment, I've got some deferred grass that's really lush and green. And actually, I'm really nervous about animals being on that at the moment. They're having, you know, I'm bringing extra hay in for them because I want to make sure that they're able to balance that protein intake. So if they've just got access to all the ground, I just feel like maybe I'm just a control freak, Flora. Maybe that's the answer, is that I'm just so kind of wanting to maintain control over what their intake is. And it's like my inner conventional person. It's like my equivalent of TMR, like mixing the ideal total mix ration. The way I'm addressing that is kind of, you know, finally balancing that high protein grass with hay and moving them every day to make that decision. But yeah, I think it always depends what you're managing for, what your land availability is, and how stressed it might make you wherever you are on the spectrum. But I would definitely
try and move them.
I would definitely try and move them.
What do you do about water though? Because even our standing tanks, the pipes freeze. And if you've got to have a long pipe that goes down the field with a thing on it, I mean, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, so we there's various ways that we deal with that. One of them is continuous flow troughs. So we don't rely on any, so here's a caveat, we don't rely on any mains water because there is no mains water where we live. So everything's either on boreholes or we're abstracting out of streams, out of burns, etc. So there's no mains water here. Mains water makes a continuous flow trough an impossibility because the cost would just be immense. Exactly. But we make use of continuous flow troughs. And so what you could do is you could have a header tank of water that you separate out, that you kind of isolate, and then you run that on a continuous flow. So basically, if water's moving, it doesn't freeze. And I think I've got a photo in the final session on managing in extremes of -15, and we've got liquid water. And that's just because we're allowing that water to move. We've got a continuous flow trough set up, very cheap, IBC, various pipes coming in and out of it, and the water comes in and goes straight out, but there's always liquid water for the animals to drink. So that's one way we do it. The other thing is if you've got fairly short sections of pipe, and generally it works best if you've got some gradient, is that you basically double up your pipes. So you, in the evening when it's going to get cold, you just disconnect the pipe and you allow it to run out, and then you reconnect it in the morning. Maybe it's normally a bit warmer so that it's kind of just above freezing, and then you can use the pipe again. And so if you double up your pipes, you've always got a spare one. If one of them has got a bit of ice in it, you can use the other one instead. And what we've been doing is we bought a couple of big 1,000-litre big round troughs. And we just will fill one of those as we're setting up fences, checking animals, sorting stuff out. And by the time it's full, that might do a couple of days. So depending on the size of your herd, and just breaking the ice on that is much less hassle and stress for a few days in really cold weather than it is kind of trying to pipe water to them. I would say as much as possible, even if we've got underground access chambers as well. So there are some pipes underground. Most of our pipes to our troughs are above ground, but there is some underground pipes. And then we've dug in access chambers so that we've always got water that we can connect into that's generally running. So yeah, there's quite a few options. It just depends again on your context and what your water supply is.
Okay, thank you.
You can also use something called a freeze miser, or you could put a bubbler in. So again, it's different ways of keeping the water flowing.
All right.
I'll try and find some examples to share with you in the last session.
Okay, thank you very much.
No worries. James has put a question in the chat. In your first photo slide, the left photo with the bare ground is what high clover swords look like in March before the clover gets going, leaving the ground bare midwinter. What's your view on legume content of the sward and seed mixes? Yeah, you're right. Quite often clover can do really, really well with pretty short grasses, particularly clovers that have been developed to coexist in perennial ryegrass dominant swards. I'm a big fan of vetch over clover and bird's foot trefoil as a legume. They're my preferred legumes for two reasons. One, both of them, and particularly vetch, is a climbing legume, so you get all the legume benefits, but you don't have it's not short. So the swards that we're kind of managing, clover struggles a bit because clover likes a short sward, particularly kind of the types of clover that have been bred. So we want, for us, a legume that can climb like a vetch or a vetchling is going to provide that legume part of the sward diversity, but is able to get up tall with the tall swards. And bird's foot trefoil is amazing because it's just it's high tannin content, so it means it can be supportive of reduced worm burden, and it also doesn't cause bloat. So you obviously get a bloat risk with high clover content in your sward, whereas bird's foot trefoil, that bloat risk just doesn't exist. But again, you get all the benefits of the legume. So yeah, I don't know, Ed, have you got thoughts on that?
I tried to grow vetch in that sward, and it grew in the first winter and then died out. So I don't know what your experience is with actually sort of sowing vetches, or have you had more natural?
It's all natural, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the arable margins are full of wild vetches, and the seeds are obviously a lot smaller, so their viability is probably a bit well, hopefully it can start to spread out across the field, but it's going to be years. But I was scattering seed-rich hay. We do that at the National Trust, so we're trying to do that quite a lot around those paddocks that Lucy sent through. I think that's probably why it's quite diverse, because it is seed-rich, but we just don't give it the time to rest, which is obviously the biggest factor of establishing grasslands. But yeah, we definitely think vetches and trefoils are beneficial, and yeah, clovers can also overtake grass swards, so we don't want that competition, do you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess it's also like the context. If you want to outwinter or you want to extend your grazing season, clover's not going to be great for that. You want your kind of bunch grasses, your tufted grasses to some extent, so like fescues, cocksfoot, etc. So again, it's all about, what do you want to manage that ground for? I think legumes amazing. Like, yeah, the fact that they're nitrogen fixing is absolutely brilliant. I think they have a really, really important role to play in a diverse sward. But I think, yeah, it's about finding sorry if you can hear the dog in the background, apologies everybody. But I think it's about finding the right legume for your context and for your setting. Any other questions? You can put them in the chat. If you don't want to unmute, that's fine. Paul, I'm going to come and pick on you because I know you've been kind of playing with grazing management. Is there anything that I've missed, or that you think I'm wildly wrong on, or your views kind of, are you in the Greg Judy or the Jim Elizondo camp, or somewhere in the middle?
Yes, well, somewhere in the middle, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, I've always been historically, I suppose, always tried to clear the paddocks out. To be honest, always been quite keen to clear them out to sort of encourage vigorous regrowth, encourage tillering. That's sort of probably very much from where my times in New Zealand, really, that sort of thing. I suppose our biggest problem that we face on the farm is we have multiple groups and we've got sheep, and kind of moving every day is when you've got multiple groups, we end up with sort of 3 bulling groups, I don't know, 4 or 5 groups of sheep. It's quite an undertaking to kind of move every day. So we sort of end up moving less, sort of 3, 4, 5 days sort of thing. So that's a bit of a thing. We'd like to do more, but it's just trying to find, if we could have one group, that would be great. If we weren't pedigree, we could have one sort of bullying mob, we could bring the herd together, that would be fantastic. But yeah, maybe that'll come, but yeah, that's where we are. I mean, that's some of the challenges. Yeah, I mean, we struggle, I suppose, with a lot of temporary lathes, herbal lathes. It's just, like you said before, the clovers die out a bit in the winter. We sort of lose a bit of that kind of, the mat effect, I suppose, and so, to keep the cows up and out of the ground. So, so we're just about actually to go into a deferred grazing bit, which we've had shut up since sort of late summer, and we're about to go into that. But at the moment, we've sort of been holding the cows back on a sort of rotating them around an area to kind of really to build fertility on a bit of ground that's about to come out of grass, go back into arable for 3 years. So we've sort of rotated them around in a kind of block grazing system there, really, to kind of get the manure around and build fertility in there. So yeah, those are little things we do. But yeah, the what probably holds us back on the kind of moving cows enough is just having multiple groups, and we need to. Maybe we should get rid of the sheep, but they're quite. They do provide quite a good income, to be fair. And I suppose the only other thing that I think probably worth mentioning that I've been to quite a few of the sort of grazing talks is the cost of land. Land is quite an expensive commodity, and it's being able to have enough income to have enough stock on there to cover the cost of the land and obviously to provide an income. So that's probably our biggest challenge, I think, for us, is to be able to keep these stocking levels high enough to make that work. And that's probably one of the things that's holding us back from giving up the arable side of it, the organic arable side. But yeah, those are my thoughts. But other than that, yeah.
Nice, thanks, Paul. I think, yeah, that thing about groups is really tricky, isn't it? Like the more groups, I was like, went into this winter, like I'm having 2 groups max and that's it. And I've currently got 3. And I'm just like, why is this happening? But yeah, it can be really difficult. And I think particularly in a pedigree situation, it's easier if you can multi-sire and you can put multiple tups or multiple bulls in with groups. But yeah, it can be trickier when you're having to separate out bulling groups. However, what I would say, it always amazes me that once people have bulled, they don't always put all those animals back together. I remember being on a farm who had like all these groups, and it was way after bulling. And I was like, what's going on with all these groups then? And they're like, oh, it's our different bulling groups. And I was like, why don't you just put them all back together? Like use different ear tags or something so that you can always tell them apart. And yeah, and they were just like, oh yeah, I just never thought about that. They've always just been separate. And yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Sometimes you just need someone like me to come in and ask a stupid question. But yeah, that's definitely a challenge. I have seen that there was a question. Yes, James's question from last week. Thank you so much for bringing that back up, because I think that's a really important one. You asked James last week about using arable fields and double crop, which is financed by the water company for nitrate production, or some of it is, and thoughts on the best species combination for cattle feeding and soil protection. So that's for outwintering on what was arable on essentially a cover crop. Is that what you're doing, James?
Yeah, that's the idea.
Yeah, nice. And I mean, it's interesting. I think I don't know if Ed or Paul, who probably have got more experience of cover crops than I have, the most because everything that we graze is permanent pasture, so I don't have any of my own experience of cover crops. From all of the farms that I work with who are using them, most of the ones that are most successful are basically whatever's left at the back of the shed just gets basically put out, and it's a good way to use up whatever there is. But I don't know, Ed, is that something that you've been playing around with?
Not massively, but I've worked on dairy farms before where it's massively part of the rotation, but it's better on lighter soils, but because you can cause quite a lot of damage to the soil. And I think like the PFLA or PFL ethos is not to damage soil. So yeah, I mean, again, if it suits your system and you're happy that it's not going to cause too much damage, it's going to work. But yeah, I mean, and if you're happy that your cattle are doing well on those cover crops over winter and not going backwards, then yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, well, we're obviously just changing our SFI and things. We've been experimenting with some cover crops this year again, and I've sort of been quite impressed with actually using forage rye and looking at incorporating, you know, like the cool season vetches. I think they're hairy vetch. I think it's something like that. So we're looking at, you know, something to that, because we quite like the, you know, being able to graze them multiple times. You know, you're having that winter growth, which is fantastic. You know, we can have a kind of low level grazing system, you know, with that. So been quite impressed with that. We've struggled, I suppose, when we first devised the system here on the farm. We sort of had this great ambition that we would have cattle on all of the arable ground over the winter to kind of help build fertility, trying to do it organically as much as we could. But we've ended up kind of moving a little bit away from some of that, because we just had and ended up using the sheep to a certain extent, and only using the cattle kind of where we're about to use them as the destructive method to remove the grass before it's going back into arable, just purely because we couldn't keep the you know, the cows out of the ground so much. You know, we just had it was lovely all the time. It was dry, but as soon as it turned wet, we would be moving every day. They still just, you know, because the ground's been cultivated, you know, you haven't got that kind of stable soil structure. Even on our lovely downland, they were, you know, making too much damage to the soil. So we've ended up moving away from that, using the sheep on those sort of slightly more sensitive arable stubbles, and obviously now starting to experiment with cover crops that we might be able to, you know, the forage rye is really helping. It's a very aggressive grower and seems to be able to, you know, help keep animals out of the soil and everything as well. So it's a learning curve for sure, but
Yeah, that's a good point actually, Paul, about the forage rye. I think lots of people are being very positive about it, but yeah, the challenge is that it just is so persistent, and then it just kind of is everywhere. Actually, we have grazed undersown barley. So there was a spring barley crop that was then taken, and we had it undersown earlier in the year with I think it was just ryegrass. And actually I was amazed. We have small cattle, and I was amazed at how well it held up. We bale grazed on it during the winter, and it was phenomenal. I really thought like they're just going to make such a mess. That was a bit further north from where we are. So that was up in the Highlands 2 years ago. And yeah, it was amazing kind of how well it held up. But I guess it's that thing of how big are your cattle? Could you use sheep instead? But yeah, there's again, Billy, who I mentioned earlier, would be a really, really good person to chat to about cover crops. They've been working on that for years. They will have been absolutely honing their species mix to suit them. So I would really recommend a chat with him. Conscious of time, so I'm just going to go to Flora's question, which is, do you have all your paddocks laid out at the beginning of the season, or are you constantly moving fences? Absolutely do not have them laid out at the beginning of the season. I'm not that organised. And although I've invested thousands in electric fence, I don't think I've got enough electric fence to have it all set up. But no, not at all. However, there are some folk that have. And actually, you know, on those kind of looser rotations, particularly on dairies, you'll see those set up with, you know, like wooden post with a single insulated hot wire running single hectare blocks. And so for some people, using a semi-permanent or a permanent subdivision on a farm makes absolute sense. For us, land access arrangements, because we work with landowners as graziers, we just are not going to put time and energy into more permanent fencing. And even on our share farm, we have re-fenced the outside, but on the inside, everything again just is movable, because sometimes we need to move on animals more quickly or not. And yeah, it just gives us maximum flexibility, and also means that we can kind of take back fences down and stuff if we need to.
Okay, thank you. I was just wondering, because it is such a huge investment, the whole wire thing.
I mean, it's interesting. Jimmy and Tom Stobbart, who are based up in Cumbria, I remember hearing them on a webinar right at the beginning of COVID. So yeah, like what, 4 years ago nearly. And the pair of them were just like, this is two brothers that run this farm, and they one year were just like, right, that's it, we're not doing this nitrogen stuff anymore. And they invested, like, instead of spending 15 grand or whatever it was on nitrogen, or 20 grand on nitrogen, they just decided to spend it on electric fences. And so they got really well kitted out with all their electric fencing, and they were like, oh God, you know, if we made the right decision here. And by investing in the fencing and changing their system, they've been able to not ever have to go back to nitrogen. So it's amazing, like actually that year's nitrogen payment, if you like, that would be a recurring cost, they were then actually able to spend that on fencing, and it no longer be a recurring cost as a one-off capital investment. So I think it definitely pays off. And there's a brilliant dairy farmer called Angus Dalton, who was running Dalton Dairies, but has now just moved down to Oxfordshire to manage a farm. And he says always invest on things that come on rolls or reels, so like big reels of water pipe or reels of electric fence, and he was like, never, or if it's got legs, he says you're allowed to invest in it if it's got legs or comes on a reel, but if it's got wheels and it needs a key, absolutely don't invest in it. So yeah, I think he's got the right idea there. Mel has asked a question. Sorry if this has been covered. What's the ideal rest time for a grass lay? I can't see how only grazing for 5% of the season would work for us. It again, it depends. But yeah, I mean, when it's 5% of the season, the way you think about that, so this is quite difficult not to have a whiteboard to draw on to show you this, but let's think if we're going to make half-acre paddocks, just because it's nice and easy for the maths. We've got half-acre paddocks across our farm, and what we're going to do is move our animals every day, because again, it's easy for the maths. So we're going to move our animals into half-acre paddocks every single day. Let's say we're on a 30-day rotation. So we've got 30 paddocks, and after we've done our 30 half acres, we're going to come back to that first paddock. So in those 30 days, that paddock has only been grazed once. And if we then extend that out up to, it was a, you know, more, we're going to have a greater rest period. Each paddock might only actually be grazed in a year 4 times. So it's quite difficult to get your head around that. If you stand somewhere in a field, that bit of the field might only have 4 grazes a year, because you've split your fields up into paddocks and you're moving those animals around. So we've got some places I would never ever graze anywhere more than 4 times in a year. And that means basically maximum amount of grazing that half-acre paddock is going to get is 4 days across the entire year. So that's 4 out of 365. That's way less than 5%. So I think that's the thing you kind of have to get your head into. You're not only grazing it, you're not like, okay, well, the year's 365 days, so 5% of that is however many days, and that's how long I leave them on for. You're maybe putting them on for a day or 2 and then moving them on and then bringing them back. And that's where your kind of 5% or 10% comes from, because actually you're then creating the rest in between those grazing days. And that's the key thing, that it's not just that they get grazed for 4 times. You know, I could graze that half acre for 4 solid days once a year, but actually I'm getting optimal grass growth and optimal soil health from grazing it once, going off, coming back, grazing it again, going off, coming back, grazing it again, disappearing, and then coming back and grazing it again. So it's quite it's a tricky one to explain without a whiteboard. Sorry, that's probably unhelpful, isn't it? Does that make sense, Mel? I don't know if you can unmute at all, or if you're maybe not able to. Maybe Mel is furiously typing, trying to say that's not what I meant at all. Does that make sense to others, or is that completely bamboozled you? Sorry if it's a bit confusing. Okay.
If anyone, I know, Nikki, you're always really welcoming of people sending stuff over. If anyone wanted to send, I don't know, would this work if someone sent in their, oh, she says she can't unmute. But if you sent in the size of your grazing platform and the amount of cattle that you had, it might be more, maybe you'd be able to give more of an idea.
Yeah, and one of the things that when I do like a full day's delivery on this, we talk a lot about allocation. So like, how much grass do I need to give my animals? How much pasture? How long should they stay there? There's a really, really useful tool that is freely available called, hang on, let me just get the link and I'll put it. I think it's called Feed Smart, and it's a New Zealand tool that's free to use, and it's a sheep and cattle feed and allocation calculator. Let me just put the link in the chat. And basically, sorry, I know we're out of time, but I'm just going to put this in here because this might be useful. So you can either, basically what you can do is either identify, so you would click on your either cattle or sheep, and you would identify your stock class. So like, I don't know, R2 heifers, and you're going to have your start date and you're going to have your weight. So I'm going to be like, okay, well, they're going to be 400 kilos. And this is the growth rate that I want. And you put in you then go into your allocation, and basically it tells you how much either kilograms of dry matter per head per day they need, or megajoules of energy that they need. So you can either go for dry matter or energy, and then you can tell it whether you want to work how long they have in a paddock. So you tell it the paddock size, they tell you how many days, or the number of animals that you can have, or your residuals, or the size of the paddock break that you're next going to give them. So you decide what you want to work out, and you put the relevant numbers in, and it then tells you the answer to that question, like how big does my paddock have to be? How many animals can I have in my paddock? So that's a really, really useful free tool. I've put the link in the chat. If you're at the start of this and you're like, how big should my paddocks be and how long can I leave them in for? And at least working out, that's the kind of underpinning bit here, is that you need to know how much your animals need to eat. And once you've worked that out, you can work out how big your paddocks are, how often you need to move them. But we've now run over, sorry, because I went off on a tangent about FeedSmart, but that's a really, really useful tool. And yeah, I'd be happy to kind of go through that in more detail, maybe another time outside of this series. We could explore that if that was useful for any of you. Oh, Ed, do you want to add anything before we finish?
Well, there's actually quite a useful app called GrazeCalc, which I've used, and that does pretty much the same. So you can it gives you the options of days in paddock, kilos of dry matter per cow per day, crop allocation, pre-grazing cover. So you can choose whichever one you want, and then add in how many cows you've got, and it will give you the allocation as well. So it's quite good.
What was it called again?
GrazeCalc.
I'll put a link. It's grazingcalculator.com, but they have an app that you download. There you go. You'll be able to find it from that link.
There you go.
Thanks, Ed. Right, next week we are going to be looking at poaching and compaction, my second favourite session. So that should be interesting, and I would love it if you could send me photos of your biggest grazing cock-ups so far. Yeah, if you're feeling brave, and I will also include mine, so some poached areas or areas of compaction, some holes that you've dug and it's like digging into concrete. It'd be really nice to be able to see some of those challenges that you've experienced, and we can share those and celebrate each other's challenges that we've had maybe over the last couple of years. If you've got absolute shockers of poaching photos, then do send them in. And yeah, thank you so much everyone for coming along. It's been really lovely to see you all. If you do have questions, then do either pop me an email or get in touch with Bella or Ali, and they can send it on to me. And yeah, there's so much more that we could talk about with grazing management, but we just don't have time. But it's been lovely to see you all. So thanks ever so much.
Thank you very
much, Nikki, and for everyone who's
Thank you.
contributed.